Divorce usually marks the end, but for Grant Anderson, it was just the prologue to a humiliation he never saw coming. He walked into the most exclusive wedding of the decade with his young trophy fiancée on his arm, smugly believing he was doing his ex-wife a favor by showing up. He expected a quaint ceremony in a rented hall. He expected to see her struggling. Instead, he walked into a world of old money and private jets, only to realize the billionaire groom wasn't the one running the show his ex-wife was. And she wasn't just surviving, she was ruling. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a subscription renewal for a golf magazine. Grant Anderson rarely read but kept for appearances. It wasn't a standard envelope. It was heavy, cream-colored cardstock, textured like linen with calligraphy so precise it looked engraved by a laser, though the slight indentation suggested a hand press. Mr. Grant Anderson and guest. Grant flipped it over, frowning. He stood in the kitchen of his modern, glass-walled condo in downtown Seattle. The condo was nice, clinical, expensive, and lacking warmth, much like his life since the divorce 3 years ago. "Who's that from Babe?" Tiffany called out from the living room. She was 24, a Pilates instructor, with ambition that outpaced her intellect, though Grant didn't mind. She was the prize he had acquired after shedding the dead weight of his previous marriage. "You won't believe it," Grant muttered, sliding his finger under the wax seal, a dark navy crest he didn't recognize. He pulled out the card. "Together with their families, Madeline Brooks and Lucas Kensington, request the honor of your presence." Grant let out a short, incredulous laugh. "It's Maddie, my ex-wife." Tiffany appeared in the doorway, holding a green smoothie. Her eyebrows shot up. "Madeline, the one who used to coupon for groceries?" "She's getting married, apparently," Grant said, scanning the details. "To some guy named Lucas Kensington. Probably an accountant or a project manager. Good for her." He tossed the invitation onto the marble island. He felt a strange mixture of annoyance and superiority. When he had left Madeline 3 years ago, she was a mess. She had supported him through business school, clipping coupons and working double shifts at a diner, only for him to outgrow her the moment his logistics startup, Anderson Freight, began to turn a profit. He remembered the look on her face when he asked for the divorce. Not anger, just a silent, crushing defeat. She had looked old, then worn down by the grind of supporting his dreams. "Are we going?" Tiffany asked, picking up the card. She ran a manicured nail over the gold lettering. "Wait, Grant. Look at the venue." Grant glanced back down. The Kensington estate, Martha's Vineyard. Private ferry provided from Woods Hole. "Martha's Vineyard," Grant scoffed. "Probably renting a cottage or a public hall during the off-season to save cash. She always was cheap." "I don't know," Tiffany murmured, her eyes narrowing. "Kensington, that sounds familiar. Like really familiar." "It's a common name, Tiff. Don't overthink it." Grant snatched the invite back. "We're going. Absolutely, we're going." "Why?" Tiffany pouted. "Do we really want to watch your sad ex get remarried to some mid-level nobody?" Grant smirked, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. "I want her to see us. I want her to see that I'm happy that I've upgraded and that I hold no grudges. It's the ultimate power move. If I don't go, it looks like I'm bitter. If I go and I bring you, it shows I've won." He looked at his reflection in the dark window of the oven. He saw a man in his late 30s, successful, fit, and thriving. He imagined Madeline probably wearing a dress off the rack, marrying a man who drove a sedan, and worried about his 401k. He wanted to witness the mediocrity of her life. It would validate every selfish choice he had made. "Book the flights, Tiff," Grant said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Let's go wish the happy couple well." He didn't know it then, but that invitation wasn't a peace offering. It was a receipt. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with Grant's usual boasting. He told his partners at the firm that he was heading east for a charity thing involving his ex painting himself as the benevolent, supportive former husband. He bought a new tuxedo, bespoke, costing $4,000. He wanted to make sure that when he stood next to Madeline's groom, the contrast would be embarrassing for them. Tiffany, for her part, was more focused on her outfit. She bought a dress that was slightly too flashy, a crimson silk number cut low in the front. "Is it too much?" she had asked. "It's perfect," Grant had assured her. "Shine, babe. Make sure no one can take their eyes off you." They flew first class to Boston, rented a luxury SUV, and drove down to Woods Hole. Grant spent the drive criticizing the New England traffic and boasting about his quarterly returns. He was high on his own supply, completely oblivious to the storm he was driving into. When they arrived at the ferry terminal specified on the invitation, Grant was confused. It wasn't the public ferry line. It was a private dock gated and guarded by two men in dark suits who looked more like Secret Service agents than wedding ushers. "Name?" the guard asked, not looking up from a tablet. "Grant Anderson," he said, leaning out the window of the rental. "And guest." The guard tapped the screen, paused, and then looked Grant in the eye. There was no smile, no customer service warmth, just a cold assessment. "Mr. Anderson, you're on the list. Park your vehicle in Lot B. The valet will take the keys. The boat is waiting." "Boat?" Tiffany asked, peering through the windshield. Behind the gate, bobbing in the water, was not a ferry. It was a sleek silver yacht, easily 100 feet long, with the name The Indomitable stenciled on the stern in matte black. Grant swallowed hard. "Must be a rental," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "People rent these things for weddings all the time. Splits the cost among the guests, usually." He parked the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. As they walked toward the yacht, the salt air whipping Tiffany's hair, Grant saw other guests arriving. That was the first crack in his reality. These weren't the people he expected: Madeline's old friends from the diner or her distant cousins from Ohio. A woman stepped out of a black town car ahead of them. Grant recognized her immediately. It was Senator Collins from New York. Behind her walked a man who looked suspiciously like the CEO of Tech-Dine, a company Grant had been trying to get a meeting with for 2 years. "Grant," Tiffany whispered, clutching his arm. Is that the guy who owns the NBA team?" Grant didn't answer. He couldn't. He felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He was walking up the gangway of a private yacht, surrounded by people whose net worth made his logistics company look like a lemonade stand. And somewhere at the end of this boat ride was Madeline. His Madeline. The woman who used to mend his socks because they couldn't afford new ones. "It's just a rental," he whispered to himself again, a mantra against the encroaching dread. Just a rental. The journey across the Sound took 40 minutes, during which Grant Anderson drank 3 glasses of champagne served by staff, who moved with the silent efficiency of ghosts. He tried to mingle, to strike up a conversation with a man leaning against the railing, but the man, a known venture capitalist named Arthur Doyle, merely glanced at Grant's lapel, saw no familiar pin or crest, and gave a polite, dismissive nod before turning away. Grant was invisible here. In Seattle, he was a big fish. Here, he was plankton. When the yacht docked, the estate came into view. It wasn't a house. It was a compound. Sprawling across a private peninsula, the architecture was a blend of historic stone and modern glass perched on cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. There were helicopters on a distant pad. A fleet of vintage Rolls-Royces waited to shuttle guests from the dock to the main lawn. "Oh my God!" Tiffany breathed, her grip on his arm, tightening to the point of pain. "Grant, your ex-wife. Who exactly is she marrying?" "I told you I don't know." Grant snapped, his composure fraying. "Lucas Kensington. I've never heard of him." "I Googled him," Tiffany hissed, pulling out her phone. "There was no service on the boat, but I have a signal now." "And, Grant, Lucas Kensington is the heir to Kensington Steel. He founded Aurora Biolabs. Grant Forbes says he's worth $8 billion. The number hit Grant like a physical blow. $8 billion. "That's impossible," he stammered. "Madeline is a waitress. Well, she was. She was an administrative assistant when we split. How would she even meet someone like that? Maybe she's the nanny." Tiffany suggested, trying to be helpful but only making it worse. "Or maybe it's a Cinderella thing." Grant didn't answer. He felt a sudden, violent urge to turn around, get back on the boat, and flee. But the crowd was moving a river of silk and cashmere, flowing toward the ceremony site, and he was swept along with it. The ceremony was set up on a cliffside lawn. The chairs were ghost acrylic, rendering them invisible against the ocean backdrop. The floral arrangements were towering sculptures of white orchids and hydrangeas that likely cost more than Grant's car. As they took their seats, surprisingly near the front in the fourth row, Grant looked around for someone, anyone who looked like the Madeline he knew. He expected to see her parents, ragged and uncomfortable in their Sunday best. Instead, he saw her mother, looking 10 years younger, wearing a tasteful Chanel suit, chatting comfortably with a famous British playwright. "This is insane," Grant muttered. "This has to be a joke." "The program," Tiffany whispered, handing him a thick, velvet-textured booklet. Grant opened it. The wedding of Lucas Kensington and Madeline Brooks, officiated by Governor Thomas Halloway. The governor. The actual governor of the state was officiating. Music began to swell, not a recording, but a live string quartet positioned in a gazebo nearby. The guests quieted, the heavy scent of the ocean mixed with expensive perfume. First came the groom. Lucas Kensington walked out. He was tall, perhaps 40, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of rugged, effortless handsomeness that money can polish but not buy. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. He didn't look nervous. He looked commanding. He stood at the altar, hands clasped, surveying the crowd with calm blue eyes. When his gaze passed over the fourth row, Grant felt a jolt. Lucas's eyes lingered on him for a fraction of a second too long, a microscopic tightening of the jaw. He knew. He knew exactly who Grant was. Then the music shifted. The heavy strings dropped away, replaced by a haunting, ethereal cello solo. The guests stood. Grant stood his legs, feeling like lead. At the top of the aisle, the sun catching the diamonds woven into her veil, stood Madeline. Grant stopped breathing. The woman he remembered was soft, quiet, always slightly hunched, as if apologizing for her existence. She wore sensible shoes and minimal makeup. The woman walking down the aisle was a queen. She had lost weight, but in a way that looked strong, not frail. Her posture was impeccable, her chin held high. The dress was a masterpiece of lace and silk hugging curves he had forgotten she had flaring out at the feet in a dramatic train. But it wasn't the dress. It was her face. Gone was the timid girl who cried when the toast burned. In her place was a woman who radiated power. Her skin glowed, her eyes fixed on Lucas, were sharp and bright. She walked with a slow, deliberate cadence, owning every inch of the ground beneath her. As she passed Grant's row, he found himself leaning forward, desperate for her to look at him. "Look at me," his mind screamed. "See me. See that I'm here." She didn't. She didn't even blink. She glided past him, as if he were part of the furniture, her focus entirely on the billionaire waiting for her at the altar. Tiffany nudged him. "She's stunning, Grant. You never told me she looked like that." "She did," Grant whispered, his voice hoarse. "She never looked like that with me." The realization was a cold knife in his gut. It wasn't that Madeline had never been capable of this beauty or this grace. It was that being with him had suppressed it. He hadn't been her prize. He had been her anchor, dragging her down into the mud of mediocrity. He sat through the vows in a daze. He heard them promise to love and cherish, to build empires together. He watched Lucas kiss her with a passion that made Grant look away, embarrassed by the intimacy of it. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The applause was thunderous as the couple walked back down the aisle, Madeline laughing, her hand firmly in Lucas's. Grant finally caught her eye, just for a second. She looked at him. There was no hate in her eyes, no lingering love. There was only a polite, distant amusement. It was the way one looks at an old yearbook photo of a haircut they regret. She offered him a small, tight smile, almost pitying, and then turned her face up to her billionaire husband, leaving Grant Anderson drowning in the wake of her happiness. "We have to go to the reception," Tiffany said, as the crowd began to disperse toward the massive glass pavilion erected on the south lawn. "I need a drink." "I need a scotch," Grant corrected. "A double." He didn't know that the real humiliation hadn't even started yet. The reception was where the business was done, and Grant was about to learn that in this world, he wasn't just out of his league, he was on the menu. The reception was held in a massive glass structure that had been erected on the cliff edge, designed to look like a floating diamond. As the sun began to set, casting a violet hue over the ocean, the interior of the pavilion glowed with the light of 1,000 candles and crystal chandeliers that hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Grant Anderson walked in, Tiffany clinging to his bicep. Ducal. He felt like an imposter in a tuxedo, a sensation he hadn't felt since his early 20s. He was used to being the biggest man in the room, the loudest voice, the one who signed the checks. Here he was, statistically insignificant. Waiters circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked like art pieces. Grant grabbed a glass of amber liquid from a passing tray, a 30-year-old scotch, and downed half of it in one gulp. "Slow down, Tiger," Tiffany whispered, eyeing a group of women near the bar who were wearing jewelry worth more than Grant's entire condo complex. "You need to network. Isn't that what you said? Work the room." "I am working it," Grant snapped, straightening his tie. He scanned the crowd. He needed a win. He needed to prove that his presence here wasn't a charity case. He spotted a target, Preston Caldwell. Grant knew the face from the Wall Street Journal. Caldwell was the CEO of Neptune Logistics, a direct competitor to Grant's company, but on a global scale. If Grant could strike up a conversation, maybe hint at a partnership. He strode over. Confidence feigned but practiced. "Mr. Caldwell Grant Anderson, Anderson Freight." Preston turned, holding a martini. He was a bear of a man with a jovial face that hid a shark's mind. He looked at Grant, his eyes flickering with recognition, not of the business, but of the gossip. "Anderson," Preston said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Ah, yes. The ex-husband." Grant froze. The title hung in the air like a foul odor. "I run a logistics firm in Seattle. We've actually been looking into expanding our Pacific routes, and I thought—" Preston chuckled, cutting him off. "Brave man, Anderson, showing up here. I have to give you credit. Most men would have mailed a gift and stayed in their hole. We remained amicable." Grant lied, his jaw tight. "Amicable," Preston repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what they call it? I heard you traded her in for a newer model right before she developed the algorithm." Grant blinked. "The algorithm?" Preston's eyebrows raised. "You don't know Madeline isn't just the bride's son. She's the architect behind Kensington Steel's distribution overhaul. She cut their logistics costs by 40% in 2 years. Lucas Kensington didn't just marry a pretty face. He married the smartest operator in the room." Preston patted Grant on the shoulder, a heavy, patronizing pat. "Enjoy the crab cakes, Anderson. I hear they're flown in from Alaska." Preston turned his back, dismissing Grant completely. Grant stood there, the blood draining from his face. "Madeline. An algorithm logistics." When they were married, he wouldn't even let her look at his spreadsheets because he said she wouldn't understand the complexities of the supply chain. "What did he mean?" Tiffany asked, chewing on an olive. "What algorithm?" "He's mistaken," Grant muttered, steering her away. "He's drunk." They found their table. Grant prayed it was in the back, near the kitchen where he could hide. But as they approached the front of the room, his dread mounted. Table 5. It was right next to the head table, a prime spot. "Wow," Tiffany said, impressed. "Maybe she really does still like you. Look at this view." Grant sat down, suspicious. The other seats at the table were empty. He poured himself wine from the carafe, his hands shaking slightly. A moment later, the other guests for table 5 arrived. First, it was a man Grant recognized instantly. Thomas Reed, his old business partner. The man Grant had forced out of Anderson Freight 5 years ago in a hostile buyout that ruined Thomas's credit and reputation. Then came Sra Jenkins, Madeline's younger sister. The one Grant had banned from their house because she was too loud and low class. Sarah was now wearing a silk gown and looked at Grant with a predatory grin. And finally, an older couple. The landlords of the first apartment Grant and Madeline had shared. The ones Grant had sued over a security deposit he knew he wasn't entitled to just because he could. It wasn't a table of honor. It was a table of ghosts. "Well, well," Sarah said, sliding into the seat opposite him. She didn't look like the messy college kid he remembered. She looked sharp. The trash took itself out, but apparently it walked back in. "Hello, Sarah," Grant said stiffly. "You look expensive." "Crypto," she said with a shrug. "And a generous brother-in-law who actually listens to investment advice. Unlike some people." Thomas Reed sat next to Grant, offering a cold, silent nod. The air at the table was toxic. Grant realized with horror that Madeline hadn't placed him here out of kindness. She had placed him here to surround him with the people he had stepped on to get to the middle. Just then the room fell silent. The bridal party was entering. Madeline and Lucas entered to a roar of applause. They moved to the head table just 10 feet away from Grant. Madeline laughed at something. Lucas whispered, her hand resting on his chest. Before they sat, Lucas Kensington turned. He looked directly at table 5. He walked over Madeline, staying back, watching with that same faint, unreadable smile. Lucas stopped in front of Grant. The billionaire was taller than Grant, broader, and possessed an aura of calm that was terrifying. Grant stood up instinctually. "Lucas," Congratulations. Beautiful ceremony. Lucas didn't offer a hand. He just looked Grant up and down, inspecting him. Grant Anderson, Lucas said. His voice was deep, resonant. I wanted to personally thank you for coming. Of course, Grant said, puffing out his chest slightly. Maddie and I share a lot of history. I wanted to show my support. Lucas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. No, Grant, I don't think you understand. I wanted to thank you for being an idiot. The conversation at the nearby tables died down. Tiffany gasped softly. Excuse me, Grant stammered. If you hadn't been so blind, Lucas said, his voice level and conversational. If you hadn't treated her like an accessory instead of a partner, she never would have left Seattle. She never would have come to Boston, and I never would have met the love of my life. Your arrogance was the greatest gift I've ever received. Lucas leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Grant and Tiffany could hear. Enjoy the dinner, Grant. I paid for it. Consider it a finder's fee. Lucas turned and walked back to his bride, kissing her hand before sitting down. Grant sank back into his chair. His face burned. He felt stripped naked in front of the entire room. Ouch, Sarah said from across the table, clinking her glass against Thomas Reed's. That's gotta hurt. Grant looked at Tiffany, expecting her to be outraged on his behalf. Instead, she was staring at Lucas Kensington with wide, fascinated eyes. He's so intense, she whispered. Grant gripped his fork until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't going to let this stand. He was Grant Anderson. He built a company from nothing. He wasn't a finder's fee. He was a player. He drank the rest of his wine. He needed a plan. He needed to corner Madeline. He needed to remind her who made her. Dinner was a blur of courses Grant couldn't taste. Truffle risotto, Wagyu beef, foam-topped scallops, it all tasted like ash. He spent the meal avoiding the gaze of Thomas Reed, who seemed content to just sit there and silently judge him. Tiffany, however, had struck up a conversation with the young man to her right, a French architect who was designing Lucas's new winery in Napa. She was laughing, flipping her hair, completely ignoring Grant. He was losing control of everything. As the plates were cleared, the speeches began. The best man. A senator told stories of Lucas's integrity. The maid of honor. A famous neurosurgeon spoke of Madeline's resilience. When I met Madeline 3 years ago, the surgeon said, raising her glass. She was starting over. She didn't have much, but she had a mind that worked like a supercomputer. She didn't just rebuild her life. She rebuilt us. She taught us that dignity isn't what you have in the bank, but how you treat people when the bank is empty. Grant scoffed audibly. Please, he muttered. She was a waitress. She was a logistics manager at a diner chain. Sarah corrected him sharply from across the table. She managed the supply chain for 50 locations while you were busy playing golf and pretending to be a CEO. You just never asked her about her day. Grant glared at her, but the applause drowned out his retort. Then Madeline stood up. The room went dead silent. She held a microphone, looking like a statue of victory. Thank you all for coming, she said, her voice clear and strong. Tonight is about love, yes, but it's also about vision. For a long time, I lived in a fog. I let someone else tell me who I was. I let someone else define my value. She didn't look at Grant, but everyone at Table 5 knew who she was talking about. I thought I was small, Madeline continued, but then I met Lucas, and he didn't hand me the world. He handed me a blueprint and asked me to help him build it. He saw the partner in me, not the prop. She raised her glass to Lucas. To finding your equal. To finding your equal, the crowd roared. Grant felt like he was suffocating. He needed air. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. Bathroom, he mumbled to Tiffany, who didn't even look up. He walked out of the pavilion into the cool night air. He loosened his tie, gasping. He paced the stone patio, anger boiling in his veins. How dare they? How dare they rewrite history? He had paid the bills. He had bought the house. He was the one with the MBA. He heard footsteps behind him, the click of heels on stone. He turned. It was Madeline. She was alone, standing near the railing that overlooked the dark ocean. She must have slipped out the side exit. "Running away again, Grant?" she asked softly. Grant straightened up. This was it. The confrontation. "I'm not running," he said, stepping toward her. "I'm just tired of the show. Finding your equal." "Really, Maddie? You think because you married a checkbook you're suddenly a titan of industry?" Madeline didn't flinch. She watched him with that same maddening calm. "You still don't get it. You think money is the only currency." "It's the only one that counts," Grant sneered. "I came here to be nice, to show you I was happy. But this circus, it's pathetic. You're playing dress-up." Madeline took a step closer. For the first time, he saw the steel in her eyes. "Grant, do you know why your Q3 projections for Anderson Freight are down 20%? Grant stopped cold. That figure wasn't public. He had only seen the internal report 2 days ago. How do you know that? Because Madeline said, I'm the one who cancelled the North Tech contract." Grant's mouth fell open. North Tech was his biggest client. They accounted for 1/3 of his revenue. They had pulled out last week without explanation, sending his company into a tailspin. "You," he whispered, "you don't work for North Tech." "No," Madeline said. "But Kensington Steel acquired North Tech 6 months ago. I sit on the board. When I reviewed the supply chain contracts, I saw Anderson Freight. I saw the inefficiencies, the padded margins, the delays. It was sloppy work, Grant. So I cut it." Grant felt the world tilting. She hadn't just moved on. She held his life in her hands. "You did it out of spite," he accused, his voice trembling. "You're trying to ruin me." "No," Madeline said, shaking her head. "If I wanted to ruin you, I would have audited your tax returns from 2019. I know about the offshore accounts, Grant." Grant went pale. "I cancelled the contract because it was bad business," she said simply. "That's the difference between us. You make decisions based on ego. I make them based on facts. You were dead weight to the company, just like you were dead weight to me." She checked her watch, a diamond-encrusted piece that probably cost more than Grant's house. "I have a cake to cut," she said. "I invited you here, Grant, not to rub it in, but because I wanted to look you in the eye and make sure I wasn't afraid of you anymore. And I'm not. You're just a small man in a rented tuxedo." She turned to leave. "Wait," Grant cried out, desperation leaking into his voice. Madeline, please, if you cut that contract, I go under. I have loans, the condo. Tiffany." Madeline stopped. She looked back at him over her shoulder. "Then I guess you better start clipping coupons," she said. She walked back into the light of the pavilion, leaving Grant alone in the dark. He stood there for a long time, the sound of laughter and music drifting out to him. He realized then that Tiffany wasn't coming out to find him. She was in there in the warmth with the winners. He pulled his phone out. He had 3 missed calls from his CFO. Grant Anderson looked at the screen, then at the ocean. The drop was steep. but the fall he was about to take in the real world was going to be much, much harder. He didn't know it yet, but the night wasn't over. And Tiffany, his prize, was about to deliver the final blow. Grant walked back into the crystal pavilion, his legs feeling like they were moving through wet cement. The air inside was stifling heavy with the scent of lilies and expensive cologne. The band had switched to upbeat jazz, and the dance floor was filling up with couples spinning in a blur of satin and tuxedos. He needed to find Tiffany. He needed to get out of here. He needed to get back to Seattle and stop the bleeding before Anderson Freight flatlined. If he could just call the bank, maybe liquidate some assets. He scanned the room, his eyes darting frantically. He expected to find Tiffany at their table, perhaps sulking that he had left her alone for so long. Table 5 was empty, save for Thomas Reed, who was casually eating a slice of wedding cake and watching Grant with the impassive stare of a judge at a sentencing hearing. Grant turned away, pushing through the crowd. "Tiffany," he muttered, bumping into a waiter. "Watch it," he snapped, though it was his own fault. He finally spotted her. She wasn't sulking. She was near the open bar, surrounded by a group of men who looked like they modeled for luxury watch advertisements. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her hand resting lightly on the forearm of a man Grant recognized, Julian Vane. No, wait. Julian was a band name. This was Carter Vance. Carter was a 29-year-old tech mogul who had just sold his app for 9 figures. He was younger than Grant, richer than Grant, and currently he was entertaining Grant's fiancée. Grant marched over adrenaline, momentarily masking his fear. He reached the circle and grabbed Tiffany's elbow, perhaps a bit too hard. "We're leaving," Grant said, his voice tight. Tiffany stopped laughing. She looked at his hand on her arm, then up at his face. Her expression wasn't one of concern. It was annoyance. "Grant, don't be rude," she said, pulling her arm away. "Carter was just telling us about his trip to Ibiza." "I don't care about Ibiza," Grant hissed, leaning in close so the others couldn't hear. "Something has happened. We need to go. Now." "The ferry doesn't leave until midnight," Tiffany said, taking a sip of her champagne. "Relax. You're sweating. It's gross." "Tiffany," Grant warned, his voice rising. "I said we are leaving. I'll pay the boat captain extra to take us now. Get your purse." Carter Vance looked at Grant with a bemused smirk. "Everything all right here, old sport? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Stay out of this," Grant snapped. He turned back to Tiffany. "Now." Tiffany didn't move. She set her glass down on the bar with a sharp clink. She turned fully toward him, crossing her arms. The crimson dress that Grant had paid for suddenly looked like armor. "No," she said. Grant blinked. "Excuse me." "I said no." Tiffany repeated, her voice steady. "I'm having fun. For the first time tonight, actually. You spent the whole boat ride ignoring me and the whole dinner pouting because your ex-wife is doing better than you. I'm not leaving just because you can't handle your ego." "This isn't about ego," Grant whispered furiously. It's complicated. I need to get back to the office." "Does it have to do with the phone call I overheard you make in the bathroom at the airport?" Tiffany asked. Grant froze. "What? The one where you yelled at your accountant about moving funds from the escrow account to cover payroll?" Tiffany raised an eyebrow. "I'm not deaf, Grant, and I'm not stupid." Grant felt the blood drain from his face. "That was just a cash flow issue. Standard business. And the insufficient funds notice on the credit card when I tried to book the spa appointment yesterday." Tiffany pressed her voice, dripping with disdain. "Is that standard business too?" The circle of men around them had gone quiet, watching the drama unfold with the detached amusement of people who had never worried about an overdraft fee in their lives. "Tiffany not here," Grant pleaded his authority, crumbling. "Please." "You know, Grant," Tiffany said, smoothing her hair, "you sold me a dream. You told me you were a king. But looking around this room, looking at Madeline, looking at Carter here, you're not a king. You're just a middle manager with a lease you can't afford." She looked at him with a clarity that was terrifying. Grant realized then that he had never really known her. He thought she was a simple, pretty thing he could possess. But she was a predator, just like him. She had just chosen a bigger carcass to feed on. "I'm breaking the engagement," she said, sliding the 3-carat diamond ring off her finger. She dropped it into the breast pocket of his tuxedo. "You can pawn that. You're going to need the cash." She turned back to Carter Vance, her smile instantly brightening. "So Carter, tell me more about the villa in Ibiza. Does it have a view?" Carter chuckled, wrapping an arm around her waist. "The best view on the island. Let's go get some fresh air." They walked away. Grant stood alone by the bar. The ring burned against his chest through the fabric of his jacket. He watched the woman he had brought as a trophy walk away with a younger, richer man, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance. He looked around. People were staring, whispering. They had seen. Grant Anderson turned and dry heaved. He needed a drink. He needed to black out. Grant found himself back at table 5. It was the only place he could sit. The rest of the room felt like a minefield. He had consumed 3 more scotches in rapid succession. The room was spinning slightly. The joyous music felt like a personal insult. "She didn't waste much time, did she?" Grant looked up. Thomas Reed was still there, nursing a cognac. The man hadn't moved all night. "Shut up, Reed," Grant slurred. "You don't know anything." "I know enough," Thomas said calmly. "I know Tiffany left with Carter Vance. Carter's a client of mine. Good kid, ruthless." Thomas swirled his drink. "And I know about North Tech." Grant slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. "Did Madeline tell you? Did she brag to everyone?" "Madeline didn't say a word to me," Thomas said. "She didn't have to. I'm the one who picked up the contract, Grant." Grant stared at him, his vision blurring. "You, my new firm," Thomas nodded. "After you pushed me out of Anderson Freight, I didn't retire. I started over. Smaller, leaner, better tech. When Madeline audited the North Tech supply chain, she put out a blind RFP request for proposal. She didn't know it was me. She just picked the best bid." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes hard. "She picked me because I offered transparency and efficiency. You were offering bloat and excuses. You lost that contract because you got lazy, Grant. You thought you were untouchable." Grant slumped in his chair. It wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't revenge. It was just the free market punishing him for his incompetence. That hurt worse than any vendetta. "Why are you sitting here?" Grant asked, his voice cracking. "Why aren't you out there celebrating my demise?" "Because I wanted to see if you'd learned anything," Thomas said. "I wanted to see if after everything you had a moment of humility." Thomas looked at Grant, disheveled drunk, abandoned by his fiancée, and on the brink of bankruptcy. "I see the answer is no," Thomas concluded. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. "You're not mourning the loss of your wife, or your business, or even your girlfriend. You're mourning your image. You're a hollow man, Grant." Thomas walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Grant was truly alone now. He checked his watch. 10:30 p.m. The ferry didn't leave until 1 a.m. He was trapped on this island for another 2.5 hours. He couldn't stay in the pavilion. He stumbled out the side door into the cool night air. He wandered away from the party, down a stone path lined with lanterns. He found himself in a manicured garden, far from the noise of the reception. He sat on a stone bench, putting his head in his hands. "Mr. Anderson." Grant looked up. A security guard stood there, massive with an earpiece. "You're wandering into a restricted area, sir. The residence is that way." I'm leaving," Grant mumbled, standing up unsteadily. "Call me a water taxi, a helicopter. I don't care. No independent departures allowed until the event concludes, sir. Island security protocols." The guard said, his voice void of sympathy. "You'll have to return to the designated guest zones." "I can't go back in there," Grant said, panic rising. "You don't understand. I can't look at them." "Not my problem, sir. Please return to the pavilion." Grant turned back toward the glowing glass structure. It looked like a spaceship ready to take off, leaving him behind on a dying planet. As he walked back, he saw a figure standing on a balcony above him. It was Lucas Kensington. The groom was smoking a cigar, looking out over his domain. He spotted Grant down below in the shadows. Grant stopped. He wanted to shout, to curse him, to demand satisfaction. But he had nothing. Lucas didn't say a word. He just raised his glass in a silent toast. It wasn't a toast of triumph. It was a toast of dismissal. Lucas was acknowledging Grant in the same way one acknowledges a bug before flicking it off a sleeve. Grant lowered his head and kept walking. He spent the next 2 hours hiding in the high-end portable restrooms, trailers with marble sinks and attendants. He sat in a stall scrolling through his phone, watching his life unravel in real time. Emails from vendors demanding payment. A text from his landlord asking about the rent check. An Instagram story from Tiffany. She was on a private jet. The caption read, "Next stop Ibiza, #upgrade." At 1:00 a.m., the horn of the yacht sounded. Grant was the first one at the dock. He boarded the Indomitable without looking back. He huddled in a corner of the lower deck, away from the other guests who were still high on champagne and laughter. As the boat pulled away from the island, Grant looked back at the estate. The lights were still blazing. The party was still going. Madeline was back there dancing with a billionaire ruling an empire, surrounded by friends and family who adored her. She hadn't needed to destroy Grant. She had simply outgrown him. Grant touched the pocket where the ring sat. He would pawn it tomorrow. It would buy him a month, maybe 2. But as he watched the lights of the Kensington estate fade into the fog, Grant Anderson knew the truth. He wasn't going back to Seattle to fight. He was going back to surrender. But the universe, it seemed, had one final twist for him. As the yacht docked in Woods Hole, 2 men in windbreakers were waiting on the pier. They weren't wedding guests, and they weren't valet drivers. They had badges on their belts. Grant stepped off the gangway, and the taller of the 2 men stepped forward. "Grant Anderson, yes," Grant said, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm Special Agent Miller with the FBI. We need to have a conversation about Anderson Freight's involvement in the import of restricted electronic components." Grant's knees buckled. I didn't sign those manifests," he stammered. "We have the logs, Mr. Anderson, and we have a witness who flipped. A Mr. Thomas Reed provided us with the documentation this evening." Grant closed his eyes. Thomas hadn't just beaten him in business. He had buried him. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent began, as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, cold, heavy steel. Grant looked out at the dark water one last time. The wedding invitation was still in his jacket pocket. "The honor of your presence." He started to laugh. a dry, broken sound that sounded like glass shattering. He had gone to the wedding to show off. He had gone to prove he was a winner. Instead, he had driven himself directly into the trap he had built for himself, brick by arrogant brick. The agent pushed him toward the waiting sedan. "Watch your head." Grant Anderson ducked into the car, and the door slammed shut, sealing him in darkness. 18 months later. The common room of the Danbury Federal Correctional Institution was loud, smelling of stale coffee and floor wax. Grant Anderson sat in a plastic chair, staring at the wall-mounted television. He looked different. The expensive haircut was gone, replaced by a standard-issue buzz cut that showed the grey spreading at his temples. He had lost 20 pounds, and with it, the softness of the good life. His face was hard aligned with the stress of a man who had lost control of his own narrative. He wasn't a king here. He wasn't even a middle manager. He was inmate 74,922, serving 36 months for wire fraud and falsifying import manifests. Thomas Reed had been thorough. The evidence was undeniable. "Hey, Anderson!" A younger inmate named Miller shouted, pointing at the screen. "Isn't that the chick you wouldn't shut up about?" Grant looked up. The channel was tuned to a business news network. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Innovator of the Year, Madeline Kensington." There she was. Madeline. She was sitting in a studio looking radiant in a white blazer. She was being interviewed about the new foundation she and Lucas had started a scholarship fund for single mothers, putting themselves through business school. "So Mrs. Kensington," the interviewer asked, leaning in, "you've been credited with revitalizing the entire supply chain model for the steel industry, and now you're tackling education. What drives you? Is it a desire to prove the doubters wrong?" Grant held his breath. He waited for her to mention him. He waited for the vindication of knowing that even in his ruin, he still occupied space in her head. He wanted her to say that her success was born from the pain he caused her. Madeline smiled at the camera. It was a genuine, warm smile. "No," she said softly. "I don't think about doubters. I'm driven by the future. The past is just a lesson, and I've already graduated." She didn't mention his name. She didn't allude to a bad marriage. She didn't reference a toxic ex. She had completely erased him. The camera cut to a shot of Lucas Kensington waiting in the wings of the studio, holding their 6-month-old daughter. Madeline looked over at them, her face lighting up with a love so pure it made Grant's chest ache. "She doesn't even hate you, man." Miller laughed, slapping Grant on the back. "That's the worst part, ain't it? You're not the villain in her story. You're just a footnote." Grant stared at the screen as the segment ended and the commercials began. He thought about the wedding invitation. He had thought it was a challenge. He had thought she wanted to show off. But now, sitting in a prison jumpsuit, he realized the truth. She had invited him because she genuinely didn't care if he was there or not. She was so secure in her happiness, so elevated in her life, that his presence was irrelevant. He was just a ghost she had made peace with. He had destroyed his business, lost his freedom, and humiliated himself on a national scale, all to win a competition that only existed in his head. Grant stood up and walked to the window. Beyond the chain-link fences and the razor wire, the world was moving on. Cars were driving on the highway. People were going to work. Tiffany was probably in Ibiza or Dubai, latching onto her next host. And Madeline was building an empire. Grant Anderson pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He finally understood the cost of the invitation. It wasn't the price of the plane ticket or the tuxedo. The price was realizing that while he had been playing a game of status, Madeline had been playing the game of life, and she had won before he even stepped off the boat. And that is the tragic yet satisfying downfall of Grant Anderson. He thought he could walk into his ex-wife's wedding and steal the show, but instead he walked straight into a reality check that cost him everything. It's a powerful reminder that the best revenge isn't anger or spite. It's simply moving on and living better. Grant wanted to be the main character so badly that he became the architect of his own destruction, while Madeline proved that true power doesn't need to shout. What do you think? Did Grant deserve his fate, or was the universe a little too harsh on him? And would you have invited an ex like Grant to your wedding? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and high-stakes drama, please smash that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves a good twist, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching Esorus World. Ching 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 Esorus World.